Where do we encounter Jesus? Can we say that we have encountered Jesus in our lives? If not, why not? Is it because he has not been there, or because we have not recognised him? The journey to Emmaus that Cleopas and his companion were making on that first Easter day was an instance of extraordinary encounter with Jesus. The journey was sad. The travellers were depressed, lost in their own thoughts. Hope had gone. Yet into the midst of their despair entered Jesus, the risen Lord. In verse 16 we read that they were kept from recognising him. Why was this so? Well, firstly, it enabled Jesus to expound the scriptures so that they might understand the truth and the necessity of the cross. Secondly, if they had recognised him, perhaps, even probably, their emotions would have overwhelmed them and prevented them from beginning to understand and learn. Thirdly, it also tested their wish or their will to learn. And then it tested their love for Jesus. Later in verse 29, we read that Jesus went in to stay with them. What if he hadn't gone in? Well, the immediate answer is that the truth of the resurrection would have been lost to the two of them, and that moment, that opportunity would have gone. What if Jesus hadn't gone in? Have you ever considered that that could have been a possibility? Yet those disciples needed to ask Jesus to stay. Jesus was willing to remain with them, but he had to be invited to do so. They were free to let him carry on walking by. And if they had, and he had, we would have lost one of the most moving and powerful resurrection appearances that we have. But still, they needed to ask Jesus to stay, and he did. It is the same for us. Jesus is there for us, ready to share our experiences, but we must ask him. We must invite him to do so. After this encounter had happened, and after Jesus had left them, the two disciples got up at once and went back. They did so even though it was late. Remember, they had asked, invited and encouraged Jesus to stay because of the lateness of the hour. Yet still they were driven enough with their hearts so burned within them that they had to return to the other disciples and tell them what had happened. Some of you will have heard me talk about this before. There are 3 stages of the journey, for them on that road and for us now. Stage 1 is linked to verse 21 and the phrase spoken by the disciples to Jesus. We had hoped. There is disappointment and misunderstanding in that phrase and in that time with Jesus on the road. How often is this the case in our lives? How often do people put their hope in something or someone, only to find the thing to be a failure or the person unable to live up to expectations? How often is hope dashed? What or who do we put our hope in? And are our hopes dashed or fulfilled? Stage 2 follows the moment of revelation and understanding. We see it in the disciples when Jesus breaks bread in verse 31. Then their eyes were opened and they recognised him. Reality, the new reality, sinks in. You see, placing our hope in earthly, worldly, even human things all too often ends in failure, disappointment and despair. Yet this needs not be the case, for we can place our hope in Jesus because he is Emmanuel, God here with us, and he will not let us down. All too often we think that we have to cope on our own, to rely on our own strength. Yet this is not the case. It is never the case. As the writer of the poem Footprints in the Sand discovers, it is in those moments of darkest despair and deepest difficulty that we hear Jesus say, "It was then that I carried you. Stage 3 is the response that follows. For these two disciples, it was the return to Jerusalem and a sharing of the encounter with those who were gathered together. They got up at once and went back. The two then explained to the 11 what had happened on the road. The experience had to be shared. These two disciples did not remain at that table and discuss how nice the walk had been or how lucky they were to have met Jesus in this way, nor did they think that while it was good to share the story sometime, it could at the very least wait until the morning. They didn't think that. They realised how important this moment was. They were excited by their encounter with Jesus, and so they dropped everything. They left everything, rather like those first disciples did when Jesus called them, and they went to tell the others what had happened. The crux, the turning point of this story comes at verse 31. They recognised him. Do we recognise God in our lives? Do we appreciate what God does in our lives? Do we know that Jesus is with us? Or are we like the writer of Footprints in the Sand, who only saw a picture of abandonment and of despair, who was on the way to Emmaus sad and alone, unaware of the truth that Jesus was actually taking each step together with them, even when it got tough, especially when it got tough. These are especially pertinent questions for us all right now. We are going through tough times. For some, these are the toughest times that they have faced for a long time, and for others, they are the toughest times that they've ever faced. Do we realise that God is here in this moment, here in this struggle, here in this challenging time with us? Do we appreciate what God is doing in our lives even now? Do we recognise the blessings that he is pouring out upon us? Or are we like the companions on the Emmaus Road, like the writer of Footprints, so caught up in our own difficulties, so focused on the self, that we forget to look outward, forget to take in the bigger picture, and forget to see how God is at work? If you are struggling right now, if you can't begin to imagine this situation coming to an end, if you're wondering how you can face each day, if you feel that hope has gone, let me remind you of Easter. Because Easter means that there is a future and that hope is reborn. And the story of the journey on the Emmaus Road reminds us that Jesus journeys with us at all times and in all places. We have not lost hope. Jesus is risen from the dead and walks with us. Let us proclaim with joy the hope of the resurrection, saying, "It is well. It is well with my soul." Amen.